I wanted to start out by just sharing a funny little story. My 9-year-old granddaughter was just here visiting from Germany, and she went home. And I called her to ask her how school was and what was she doing. Was she done with homework? And she said, no, homework is done. I'm laying on the couch, watching TV, playing with my phone. It's a good life. And I just wanted to say that coming to Florida, that's a good life too. So thank you for inviting me to come speak. These are my disclosures. I've actually had a very fun experience in being able to be a part of planning and designing and implementing 4 PET programs here at St. Luke's. And no matter what you're doing, whether you are starting from scratch or if you're adding PET to an existing program, as you start the planning process and you select your equipment, that will very nicely tie in with staffing paradigms. And when you're talking about space and staffing and scheduling, all 3 of those are essential components to maximize workflow efficiencies, and they're all 3 very dependent upon one another. So if you're lucky enough to be able to start from scratch, that's probably the best scenario that you could have. And as Dr. Heller already kind of alluded to, and as you probably heard already this morning, as you're starting to think about your program and how you want to go about it, you really want to start looking at what is your current capacity, how many spec studies are you doing, what do you anticipate those would move over to PET imaging, what are your capacities on those cameras? Are you full? Are you not full? And also taking into account, are there new programs that you want to actually implement? And again, kind of like Dr. Heller and everyone has talked about today, we elected when we started our PET-CT program and integrated it with SPECT, we added cardiovascular CTA as well as coronary calcium scoring. So we did integrate PET into a current SPECT program, and we had the luxury of being able to design our space from the get-go and kind of maximize efficiencies, not just with the space, but that allowed us to have efficiencies with our staffing as well. As you can see up here, do I have a, yep. The way this room is set up, we have our control room here, which is actually also a staff workspace. We have our SPECT camera here. We have our PET-CT camera here. Across the hall, we actually have an FDG holding area that is leaded. That used to be a waiting room. That's been converted now to the FDG holding room. And then we have our patient prep area, and we have our hot lab. Having the space designed like this also allowed us to have the efficiency with our staffing. So our staffing paradigms consist of an exercise physiologist, the nuclear medicine technologist, a nurse, and then also a CT technologist. And the CT technologist is actually there only half a day because we have 4 sites, so she goes from one site to the next performing CTAs. So you can maximize your staffing if you have the luxury of being able to start from ground zero. This is just an example of what our patient schedule looks like. Because we are so centrally located all in one space, we can utilize that one same core group of staffing to perform SPECT and PI in the morning. And we usually start that about 7:30, and the last patient appointment is at 11. Primarily, we are using stress-first protocols. About 40% of our patients will need resting images. So that patient may come back later in the afternoon, but again, because of the way the space is designed, you can keep an eye on patients on the SPECT camera doing their resting images while you're performing your PET images as well. And then on the PET-CT camera, we start with CTAs and calcium scorings in the morning, and then in the afternoon starts our PET schedule. So this just kind of gives you an idea of how you can coordinate your patient schedule and maximize efficiencies with one team of staff. If you don't have the ability to start from scratch and you want to consider starting your program utilizing existing PET equipment, whether that's PET equipment through radiology, or if you other service lines are utilizing PET imaging, you can share this equipment. We actually, in the past year, have moved all of our mobile oncology PET imaging at each 4 of our metro locations in-house on the cardiac PET CT camera. So it is possible to share. I won't tell you it's not without its own share of challenges, but you can share either the equipment, you can share equipment and space, or you can share equipment, space, and staffing. If you're going to share staffing, really the only staff you're going to have to share is the nuclear medicine technologist. And then the question becomes, do you share them? Do you have 2 nuke med techs, one focusing on oncology, one focusing on cardiology? And then who owns that staff? Who owns the equipment? Who's going to get the revenues and the expenses? Those are all age-old questions to be decided. If you're going to share the nuclear medicine technologist, it is really important that these nuclear medicine technologists are really well trained, that they become boarded, they take their NCT boards, they go on and they become PET boarded. We've also now are encouraging our nuclear medicine techs to also take the NMTCB CT boards, so that they have all of the knowledge that they need to be able to do, whether it's just cardiology PET imaging or oncology or both. We have taken the opportunity to cross-train some staff, which does benefit both service lines if you're going to be sharing space and equipment. So what do you gain by the collaborative approach if you're going to have to share equipment? I think most importantly for all of us, this is a time where financial availability to purchase new equipment is very limited. Most hospitals every year our available dollars for capital budget goes lower and lower and lower. So if you do have the opportunity to share, you do get the benefit of replacing equipment and trying to stay with state-of-the-art equipment a little bit easier than if each service line has its own PET CT camera. So how do we do that? How do we incorporate oncology PET, CTs, calcium scores, SPECT imaging, all in one space, again, kind of utilizing shared staffing? Now, the one thing I do want to go back, whoops, wrong way. I do want to go back and tell you, though, that we do maintain separate cost centers for our programs. We do have separate staff, separate nuclear medicine technologists, so I just did want to emphasize that as well. So this is what our patient schedule looks like. So oncology PET, when we were taking a look at what their volumes are compared to what our volumes are on cardiology PET, we had the higher percentage of volumes in cardiology. Oncology didn't really need the camera at some of our locations every single solitary day. They didn't have that high of volume. The same thing went for our CTA program at some of these sites. We didn't need it every single solitary day. So we alternate days. So on Monday, Wednesdays, and Fridays, we have oncology PET in the morning. Again, we're doing SPECT imaging from 7:30 to 11. When oncology finishes the camera, we then have it for cardiology PET in the afternoon. And then on alternate days, we do the calcium scorings and the CTAs in the morning, PETs in the afternoon, and again, SPECTs in the morning. So again, if you are creative, you can come up with ways in which you can share space and time and patient scheduling and staffing and maximize efficiencies and get the best bang for your buck out of both imaging modalities. So just when you think you've got it all figured out when it comes to staff, space, and scheduling, there are a lot of other practical considerations that you have to take into account. And one of them, if you're at a facility where you're both doing inpatients and outpatient testing, you need to keep in mind what status is that patient. Is that patient an inpatient or are they an observation patient? Because if they're considered a hospital outpatient, you still have to go through all of the mechanisms of having the test pre-authorized. So it's kind of nice to know up front what's the status of that patient, because for timing and for better image quality and the better outcome for the patient, we want to try to steer those inpatients to PET imaging. But you're going to have to know what their admission status is before you can just do that routinely. Because you're sharing and everyone has a limited amount of time on the camera, you really have to look at your turnaround times and how quickly can you get patients turned around. And so even with SPECT, you have to be considering your protocol selection and how often can you do a stress first or a stress only study. Is your patient population one that is routinely going to need a full study? Then this paradigm might not work for you the best. But taking all of that into consideration is important. And then just coordinating the schedule, if you're doing both inpatients and outpatients, incorporating both of those into your patient schedule can be a practical challenge as well. And then the pre-authorization piece, and Denise will talk about that in a few minutes as well. So just to kind of summarize, I think this is a really exciting time for PET. And I think it's exciting to see more and more facilities kind of get into the game of PET and add it. I think for myself, if I was a patient, I definitely would want to have a PET MPI versus a SPECT MPI. But as you are the administrators for your departments, you have to remember that it's a really fast and changing world, and you got to keep up with the pace. So you have to remember to be proactive, adaptive, creative, and efficient. And I thank you very much for your time.